Not fear exactly, but uneasiness, the kind that sits quietly in your chest and refuses to leave. Jonathan Roumie later said he couldn't explain why his heart felt so heavy that day. Nothing dramatic had happened, no argument, no bad news, yet something inside him kept saying, "Pay attention." He had spent years playing the role of Jesus on screen, speaking words about love, truth, sacrifice. At first, it was just acting, lines on a script, but over time, those words began to follow him off the set. They stayed with him in silence, in prayer, in moments when the world felt loud and divided, and that division was everywhere now. Faith and power were mixing in dangerous ways. Jonathan noticed it in headlines, in rallies, in social media posts that spoke about God with total certainty, but very little humility. People weren't just supporting a political leader anymore. They were defending him like a symbol of faith itself. Questioning the leader had slowly started to feel like questioning God. That terrified him, because history had seen this before. That night, Jonathan sat alone with his phone. He didn't plan a speech. He didn't prepare an argument. He just pressed record and spoke from the place most people avoid, the soul. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but his message carried weight. When power and faith collide, he said, the soul of a nation is tested. He didn't name anyone. He didn't accuse. He didn't attack. But the moment the video went online, one name filled the comments: Donald Trump. Some people felt exposed. Others felt offended. A few felt grateful. The reaction was intense because the message touched something deeper than politics. It touched belief. Jonathan wasn't saying Trump was evil. He wasn't predicting the end of the world. What he was doing was far more uncomfortable. He was asking people to look inward, to ask themselves why they believed what they believed, to ask whether faith had become a tool for comfort instead of truth. He spoke about how dangerous it is when people stop questioning leaders because those leaders make them feel safe. Faith, he later said in a quiet interview, is meant to humble us, not arm us. Those words shook people. Because for many, Trump wasn't just a president. He was a protector, a fighter, someone who spoke loudly in a world that felt chaotic. And when someone comes along and gently suggests, "Be careful who you place your hope in," it feels like betrayal. Jonathan received messages from all sides. Some called him brave. Some called him a traitor. Others begged him to explain himself better. But the messages that stayed with him the most were the confused ones. I love God, but I'm angry all the time now. Why? I defend this man harder than I defend my faith. Was this warning meant for him or for us? That last question mattered most, because maybe the warning was never about Donald Trump alone. Maybe it was about what happens to people when fear replaces reflection, when loyalty becomes blind, when faith becomes identity, and identity becomes something that must be protected at all costs. Jonathan talked about a simple truth many don't want to hear. God does not need defenders. God asks for followers with open hearts, not clenched fists. He reminded people that even in the Bible, the loudest crowds often followed the wrong voices. That being chosen by people is not the same as being chosen by God, and that certainty can be far more dangerous than doubt. Slowly, something strange happened. The video disappeared, no explanation, no apology, just gone, and that silence was louder than any headline. People started asking harder questions. Why did this message feel threatening? Why did it make so many uncomfortable? And why did it feel less like an attack and more like a mirror? Jonathan stopped posting for a while, not because he was afraid, but because he understood something important. A true spiritual warning doesn't force a reaction. It waits for people to wrestle with it on their own. Late one night, Jonathan received a message from a man he had never met. I supported Trump because he made me feel chosen. The message read, "Your words made me realize maybe faith was never supposed to feel like that." Jonathan sat in silence for a long time after reading it. If even one person felt that shift, then the warning had already begun its work. But a question remained, a chilling one. If this really was a spiritual warning, what would happen to those who laughed it off, ignored it, or twisted it to protect what they already believed. Because history shows us something we often forget. Spiritual warnings rarely come with lightning and thunder. They come as quiet moments of discomfort, and the most dangerous thing a person can do is silence that discomfort. So, the real question is not whether Jonathan Roumie was warning about Donald Trump. The real question is this: what happens when a nation hears a warning and decides it doesn't want to listen? And if this was only the beginning, what was it meant to prepare us for next? The reaction did not stop after the first message. In fact, it grew louder. Jonathan Roumie felt it the moment he woke up the next day. His phone was full, but it was not the number of messages that bothered him. It was the tone. People were not asking what he meant anymore. They were demanding to know whose side he was on, support or enemy, loyal or traitor. That scared him, because faith was never meant to work that way. In a quiet interview, Jonathan said something most people ignored at first. He said fear changes how people hear truth. When people are afraid, they don't listen to understand. They listen to defend themselves. Across the country, that fear was growing. The world felt unstable, economies unsure, cultures changing. People wanted someone strong to promise safety. Donald Trump symbolized that strength for millions. He spoke confidently. He never sounded unsure. And in uncertain times, confidence feels like truth. Jonathan knew that feeling. He understood why people were drawn to it. That's why he was careful not to attack the man, but to question the reaction around him. He watched crowds chant with certainty, using faith language not to pray, but to prove loyalty. That was the danger. Because when belief becomes proof of identity, it can no longer be questioned. Jonathan shared a quiet example from his own life. He said when he played Jesus, he learned something surprising. Jesus never begged crowds to follow him. In fact, when crowds grew too obsessed, he often walked away. That alone made people uncomfortable. Because modern faith often measures success by numbers, noise, and power. The next wave of backlash came fast. Videos accusing Jonathan of betrayal. Posts claiming he was attacking Christianity. Others said he was being used by the media to weaken believers. None of those claims were true, but they revealed something real. People felt threatened, not because their faith was under attack, but because it was being examined. Jonathan received a long message from a middle-aged man who had lost his job during tough times. The man wrote that Trump made him feel seen, made him feel chosen. Jonathan replied with honesty. He said being seen by a leader is powerful, but being loved by God should never depend on a leader. That message never went viral, but it mattered. Slowly, stories began to surface. A church arguing over politics instead of prayer. A family that stopped eating together because every conversation turned into defending a leader. A young believer who stopped attending services because sermons felt more like campaign speeches than spiritual guidance. Jonathan didn't comment publicly on these stories, but he carried them quietly. He realized the warning was spreading not as information, but as discomfort. People were starting to feel something was off, even if they couldn't explain it. That's when Jonathan said something privately that later leaked online. He said the most dangerous moment for faith is when people believe God agrees with them automatically. Because once that happens, repentance disappears, humility disappears, listening disappears. Another interview surfaced where Jonathan explained that questioning a leader does not weaken faith. It strengthens it. Blind loyalty weakens it. Those words angered some and freed others. At the same time, political voices grew louder. Faith language was used more aggressively. God's name was spoken with certainty, but rarely with silence or reflection. Jonathan stepped back from posting. People assumed fear. In reality, it was restraint. He knew warnings lose power when repeated too loudly. One evening, Jonathan received a message that he never shared publicly. It said, "I defended Trump so hard that I stopped defending kindness. I didn't notice until your warning made me uncomfortable." Jonathan knew then that the message had already done what it was meant to do. It was not meant to divide. It was meant to reveal motives, reveal fears, reveal misplaced hope. But another thought began to trouble him deeply. What about those who felt no discomfort at all? What about those who felt more justified, more confident, more aggressive after hearing the warning? History had shown this pattern before. Warnings don't stop events. They expose hearts before events happen. Jonathan looked at the world around him and felt the weight return, because warnings only help those willing to pause. And if too many refuse to pause, the cost is never immediate. It comes later, quietly, after the cheering stops, after certainty fades, after faith is left confused and wounded. The question that haunted him now was simple but terrifying. If this warning was already being ignored by so many, what kind of moment was the world rushing toward without realizing it? The change was subtle, but it was everywhere. Jonathan Roumie noticed it in the way conversations shifted. People didn't talk about faith anymore, they debated it. They didn't ask questions, they defended positions. And most troubling of all, they no longer sounded curious, they sounded certain. Jonathan understood certainty well. He had studied Scripture long enough to know that certainty often appears right before collapse, not because truth fails, but because humility disappears. In private conversations, Jonathan began hearing the same pattern again and again. People would say, "I don't care what he does, God is using him," and then stop listening completely. That sentence bothered Jonathan deeply, because when people believe God is automatically on their side, they stop checking their own hearts. That's how warning signs get ignored. Around this time, Jonathan shared a story in a small gathering. He spoke about how, in the Bible, people often demanded a strong king because they were tired of uncertainty. They didn't want wisdom anymore. They wanted assurance, and assurance always comes with a cost. He said fear makes people crave control, and control makes them excuse anything that promises safety. Across the country, the same energy grew stronger. Faith language became sharper. Compassion became conditional. If someone questioned the leader, they were labeled weak, lost, or even evil. Families began avoiding each other. Churches avoided hard conversations. Silence became easier than honesty. Jonathan felt a deep sadness because this wasn't rebellion against God. It was devotion misdirected. He received a message from a young woman who said she was scared to admit doubt anymore because doubt meant rejection. Jonathan responded gently, saying doubt handled with humility often leads closer to truth than certainty handled with pride. But messages like that don't spread fast. Anger does, certainty does, fear does. That's when Jonathan realized something painful. Many people didn't want a warning. They wanted reassurance that everything they already believed was correct. And anyone who disturbed that reassurance felt like an enemy. Jonathan watched faith become a shield instead of a guide. He saw people defend words and actions they once knew were wrong, simply because admitting it now felt too costly. That's when the warning grew clearer in his own heart. The problem was never one man. It was what people were willing to surrender in exchange for comfort. Integrity, compassion, self-examination. Jonathan quietly stepped further away from public discussion, but the movement around him didn't slow down. It intensified, rallies grew louder, language grew harsher, listening grew rarer, and something else happened that frightened him most of all. People stopped feeling uneasy. What once felt questionable now felt normal. History had taught him this lesson well. The most dangerous stage is not chaos. It is normalization, when extremes feel ordinary and reflection feels unnecessary. Jonathan wrote in his private journal that day, "When faith stops correcting power, power will eventually rewrite faith." He didn't share it. He didn't post it, but the truth of it haunted him, because warnings are meant to interrupt direction, not decorate it. And by now, it felt like too many people were moving forward without looking back. One final message arrived that night. It was short and unsettling. "I don't think people are listening anymore. I think they've already decided." Jonathan stared at the screen, feeling the weight return heavier than before. Because if hearts were already closed, Then the warning had done all it could do. The question was no longer whether people would listen. The question was whether anyone would recognize the moment when belief quietly turned into something else entirely. And if that moment had already arrived, would anyone be brave enough to say it out loud before it was too late? By the time Jonathan Roumie fully understood what was happening, the ground had already shifted. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, almost polite. That's what made it so dangerous. People hadn't abandoned faith. They had reshaped it, molded it to fit their fears, their anger, their need to feel in control. Jonathan felt it when invitations quietly stopped coming. Not cancellations, just silence. He felt it when old friends spoke carefully around him, as if truth itself had become risky. What troubled him most was not rejection, but confidence. People were no longer wrestling with questions. They had answers, and those answers left no room for reflection. In one private conversation, a respected faith leader told Jonathan something chilling. He said, at this point, correcting them would feel like betrayal. That sentence revealed everything. Faith had become loyalty, and loyalty had replaced conscience. Jonathan realized then that many people were no longer following beliefs, they were protecting identities. Admitting error now felt like losing oneself. Across the country, the signs were clearer to anyone willing to see. Sermons sounded more like defenses than guidance. Compassion was offered selectively. Love had conditions. Disagreement was treated as danger, and the most frightening part was how normal it all felt. Jonathan remembered how history always repeats the same pattern. First comes fear, then comes a strong voice promising protection, then comes permission to excuse what once felt wrong. He thought about the crowds in Scripture who cried for peace but demanded power instead, how quickly devotion turns aggressive when questioned. One night Jonathan returned to a quiet church, empty and dimly lit. Sitting alone, he understood something painful. Warnings don't stop collapse, they reveal it. They show who is still listening and who has already chosen comfort over truth. He remembered his earlier message, the one that shook so many souls, and wondered how many had truly heard it. Not agreed with it, but heard it. He opened his phone and saw another message, this one from a pastor who had stepped down quietly after his congregation split. The message said, "I realized too late that I was guarding influence more than integrity." Jonathan closed his eyes. The cost was becoming visible now, not dramatic, not explosive, but deeply human. Broken trust, divided families. Faith turning defensive instead of transforming. Jonathan knew then that the most important damage doesn't happen when belief is attacked from outside, but when it hardens from within. When faith becomes something to protect instead of something that shapes humility. As days passed, Jonathan stopped speaking publicly altogether. Some assumed defeat, others assumed guilt. In truth, he understood something they didn't. Silence was no longer avoidance. It was acknowledgement. The warning had been delivered. What followed was choice, and choice always reveals character. One final thought haunted him as he watched the world move forward with confidence untouched by reflection. The most terrifying spiritual moments are not marked by chaos or collapse, but by applause, when people cheer without listening. When certainty feels peaceful, when questioning feels sinful, because by the time everyone is sure, it's usually too late. And the question that now lingered heavier than ever was this. If so many people felt no discomfort at all, if nothing inside them paused or questioned or softened, then what exactly had faith become, and how far was the world willing to go before anyone admitted they had lost their way? It ended without fireworks, no final speech, no dramatic confession. Just a quiet realization that settled slowly, like dust after a long collapse. Jonathan Roumie understood something many never do. Warnings are not meant to be proven right. They are meant to be remembered when it's already too late to deny them. Time passed, the noise faded into routine. Arguments became background sound. Faith continued to wear the same words, but something inside it felt thinner, more fragile. People moved on, convinced they had chosen correctly, convinced certainty had kept them safe. but the cost had already been paid. Jonathan saw it in small, heartbreaking ways, in believers who prayed less and argued more, in families that stopped speaking, not because they hated each other, but because love had become conditional, in churches that felt busy but no longer felt holy. Faith hadn't disappeared, it had been repurposed. And the most painful truth was this: no one felt shocked anymore. What once felt wrong now felt familiar. Jonathan never said, "I told you so." He never needed to. History does that on its own. He returned to the one place certainty never mattered. Silence, reflection, prayer without audience. One night he wrote a final line in his journal, not for the public, not for debate. God was never silent. We were just too loud to hear him. That was the ending, not victory, not defeat, a mirror, because the warning was never about Donald Trump. It was never about politics or power alone. It was about hearts, about how easily fear disguises itself as faith, about how quickly devotion can turn into defense, about how comfortable it is to follow a strong voice instead of a still one. And here is the truth that lingers long after the story ends. Warnings do not change the future by force. They change who we are willing to become. For some, this message planted a seed. For others, it was ignored, and that difference mattered more than any outcome. Because when the moment finally arrives, when certainty cracks and confidence fades, people will remember not the noise, but the quiet discomfort they once silenced. And they will ask themselves one final question: was the warning meant to scare us or to save us?